It is 9 a.m. joint Village Council workshop with Pinecrest Parkway Citizens Committee. So I'll call the meeting to order. First, we'll do a call of the members, and we'll get started.
Councilmember Mercado? Here. Councilmember Hookemer?
Here.
Councilmember Kraft?
Here.
Vice Mayor Abbott?
Here.
Mayor Corradino?
I'm here.
Mayor, I'm going to be calling the roll for the Pinecrest Parkway Citizens Committee. Mr. R. Soni? Mr. Jose Casanova?
Here.
Mr. Mateo?
Here.
Mr. Douglas Kulik?
Here.
Mr. John Farrar?
Here.
Vice Chair Trugo? Chairperson Medina?
Here.
Hey, Mayor, a quorum is present.
Okay, perfect. Let's do the pledge of allegiance. and we'll get started. Pledge allegiance
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to say thank you for being here and thanks for being part of the process, every one of you. And I know it's been a long time. It's not, and it's probably been a lot of fun. It's something different, and to not in the Sunshine Group, not having to be able to talk to one another outside of the meetings is also a challenge. So I just wanted to thank you on behalf of all of us for all the hard work you've done on behalf of the citizens of Pinecrest. Okay, so who's up?
Steve, do you want to kind of explain what we're doing?
Good morning, Mayor, Council members, Madam Manager, Steve Olmstead, Planning Director for the Village of Pinecrest. The Pinecrest Parkway Citizens Committee has met 5 times. The first meeting was June 9th, and they've also conducted a visioning session. This would be their 7th meeting if you count this meeting and the visiting session then. And the committee, the terms of the committee sunsets at the end of this month. So their last meeting will be September 27th. The purpose of this meeting is basically the consultants, MHCP CoLab and MKSK Architects were hired by the Village of Pinecrest to facilitate the planning process. Melissa Hagee with MHCP CoLab is here this morning, and her husband Matt Hagee is also here. And they're going to provide a brief presentation of the framework of the plan and some of the results and areas of consensus that we've reached with the committee so far.
Melissa, can you take over from me?
Can everybody hear me sitting here?
Melissa, if you don't mind grabbing the microphone and just speaking into the microphone as the meeting is being live streamed, and that way I'm sure that they're able to hear the.
You can take the microphone off the.
Whichever is easier. Thank you.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. My name is Melissa Hagee. As Steve mentioned, our company was hired along with MKSK to lead the visioning process of the visioning update. We've had 5 meetings with the committee, and we've gotten a lot of good input. All of the meetings have been public, and all the meetings have had public comments. We've also had a visioning session, which was held a couple of weeks ago. It was a 4-hour open house where people talked with us and gave us their input, shared their comments, provided input in a survey form. So in a short period of time, we have gotten a lot of public input. We've had over 16 hours of, maybe it's even more now, of meetings, and over 100 participants over the course of these 6 public meetings. We've also met with many of you and gotten your input, and so in a concise time frame, we feel like we've heard from a lot of different people and got a lot of input. So this presentation is reflective of where we are to date, and we're looking for your input, and we're looking for discussion from the committee as well. So I'll start with the first 2 slides, and then we can have a back and forth. So when you do a visioning plan, what comes to light are these overall themes. And the themes that we heard time and time again through all of our meetings and outreach with the committee, meeting with all of you, are these 7 ideas. And we'll go through them in this presentation. So the first one is capitalizing on market opportunities with a mix of uses. And what this means is there was a study that was done in 2020 that looked at your market opportunities, and so we were using that as the base. It did say that there are opportunities for mixed uses, opportunities for town centers, that bulk of the residents had a high disposable income. They were not spending it in Pinecrest. It was being spent outside of Pinecrest, and that there was a demand for housing, there was a demand for retail and eating establishments, and people in your community are spending the money outside of the village. So this is a gap and an opportunity. And the second one is developing a clear framework for development. We want to be really clear about what it is that the village wants, what does the community want, especially in light of the county and the county's rapid transit zone ordinance, which is looking to increase development around transit stations. And as you know, we have 2 stations that are planned at 104th and 136th, and then you have your existing station at Dayland North and South. The third is about architecture, and we went back and forth with the committee and also with the community. There is an interest, a strong interest and an expectation of having really high quality architecture, but not necessarily a specific style or theme. So we're looking at ways to recommend and legislate good architecture, good design. That's in keeping with what the committee's recommendation is. The fourth is enhancing the public realm around the stations and the station areas. So how do you start to make the areas around 104th, around 136th, and around Dayland? How do you make those better and more engaging? Looking at town center options, looking at mixed uses, and sort of tying back to what you have now is your Pinecrest business alternative districts. And we were brought on, one of the things we were looking at was expanding those districts to 104th and 136th. Number 5 is ensuring transitions between existing residential and commercial development. And this is really about buffers. So when you have new development and you have commercial development, how's it going to impact the communities behind, the single family, some of the townhouses, some of the other residential that you have that abuts the commercial? And so we have specific recommendations for that. Number 6 is defining a character for the parkway, the overall parkway, and a brand for the corridor. And we talked about landscaping, signage, lighting, and specific things that, so that when people are driving through and when they arrive in Pinecrest, they know that they're in a special place. And then the last one is about connectivity, pedestrian and bicycle connectivity, and looking at opportunities for connecting the community and the residents that live adjacent to the parkway to the activities on the parkway. And that was something that we heard, again, in different meetings from the committee and from the public, that it would be nice to be able to walk from my house to whatever new development is being built. Right now I have to drive, it's not safe. Okay. So I just want to start with this. So when we started our analysis, we wanted to understand what was the existing zoning and what could you build under the current code. And what you can see is 3 diagrams, 3 models of the 3 different areas. So the first one is the Dayland north-south area. And so the red triangle that's in a circle is the triangle that you see on the left side of the screen that's marked 88th Street. And so the second circle is 104th, which is also red, and then the third circle is 136th Street, which is on the bottom, the largest parcel where the Home Depot is. And what we found is that under your current code, this is what you can build. It's very similar to what you have now.
I apologize, the circle on this graph is not around 104th Street. The circle,
Okay.
104th Street is above it, where the blue building is, and That's south of 104th Street.
Well, the image on the second image on the left
Right,
is the model of 104th Street.
right.
So the point is what can be built under your current code.
I'm just saying, your graphic, the circle needs to move up,
North.
north. The circle
Okay.
is too low, it's too close up.
Okay. We'll adjust that for the next presentation. Thanks for pointing that out. So what we want to show with this, and the reason why we're showing this is because there's certain things that aren't supporting redevelopment right now. The first thing is your open space requirements are not requiring the spaces to be grouped together. It's requiring separate spaces, as you can see in the 3 diagrams with the green spaces shown. The second is that you have a really high parking requirement, and your parking is required between the buildings, so you can see the gray surface parking lots on each of these diagrams and each of these models. That's the way your code requires the parking to be built out. Structured parking is not really encouraged, and it's a conditional use. So some of these things can be addressed with structured parking or having the parking centralized. And then the last thing is that your residential is limited to 25% of the building, and it's really only permitted on the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th floor, or the 3rd and 4th floor. So right now your code is not permitting a lot of mixed-use type development for these reasons. It just doesn't make sense. You can't get a big enough, yeah.
Okay, I'll ask a question. Is residential is allowed then in these districts at the current time?
So right now in the North District, Dadeland, North and South, and then the areas, right now you have 3 Pinecrest business alternative, North Pinecrest business alternative districts. And in those districts, 25% of any building can be residential.
Okay, but not in the existing zoning around 136th Street or 104th, right?
Correct.
Okay, so that residential is not allowed in the existing zoning. They're only in the North Pinecrest business group.
Right, so
Understood.
all of the red, sorry, I should have started with this. All of the green is your single family. All of your yellow is multifamily or higher density single family. And all of the red, pink, and other colors are just variations of commercial. And a lot of it has to do with liquor licenses or different, it has more to do with the uses and what's permitted. Anything in the North Pinecrest Business Alternative District can go up to 4 stories. Many of the residential can go up to 4 stories. In the North Pinecrest Business Alternative District, you can go up to 0.73 FAR if you meet certain criteria. But the point is that there's no real incentive to go to a 4-story because of these limitations that you have with the parking, with the open space, and with your percentage of residential. So financially, it doesn't make sense for someone to come in and build just a quarter of the building residential. So that's why there's not a lot of momentum in terms of redevelopment on these parcels.
Just for clarity, you said that the yellow was multifamily? I don't believe that's
It's
correct.
either multifamily or higher intensity single family.
No, the yellow is like
Single family.
single
Yellow
family half
is
acre.
EUM, residential modified estate, and it allows for 15,000 square foot lots of single family.
So it's like a single family per half acre, right? Correct.
I have a question.
No, where this is between the group and the council.
Okay,
And
great.
no questions.
Right, so we've
16 hours of questions.
We've run through a lot of this information in different meetings, so I apologize if this is our first time presenting to you. If there's some information that I omitted, just let me know and I'll backtrack. But we do have all the information about what's permitted and all the zones and the heights and different things, but the point of this slide is to show you the limitations of your current zoning and why you're not right now having a development interest.
So this drawing only shows 0.73 FAR, right? Are we talking about?
This drawing is showing what's currently allowed. So on 88th Street, you have the ability to go up to 0.73 and 4 stories, and you can see that they don't get to that because there's not enough space. On 104th Street and 136th Street, it's not the same zoning. It's not permitted. But you can see that the buildings are small, and you have to have space in between the buildings, so it's not possible to get a larger building and a more substantial development under the current code. That's looking into the parking requirements. That's taking into consideration all the setback requirements. This is what you have. This is the best. This is the best that you can get on the most intense development under your current code. Okay. So what we'd like to do is have an open discussion on this. This is what we presented last week with the committee. The text that's underlined are the things that the committee directed us that they would like to do. Anything that's not underlined is what was presented and approved, and then you'll see on some of the other slides there's process. But as I explained, in terms of the market opportunities, there is a gap in terms of opportunities for uses. So when we do our analysis and we look at opportunities, it's got to be based on, on real demand. And so the demand, according to the market study, was for retail, was for housing, was for restaurants. And as I said, you have a lot of disposable income in your community and very high incomes compared to the rest of the county, and it's not being spent here, so it's a missed opportunity. I think most people would prefer to have entertainment, restaurants, things to do within the community that they could walk to, that they could get to easily, rather than crossing US1 and going to Dayland, going to the Falls, going to some of the other entertainment centers. And there is in the back of your market analysis that was done in 2020, there's actually a survey and asked people, where do you like to go? And that, very few said Pinecrest. Most people are going to Dayland, the Falls, and further Coral Gables, further north. So what's the right mix of uses? So what came out of the conversation last week was that, yes, we want to create a destination. It's important for the community to have a destination. They would like to increase the residential percentage, but the suggestion was, rather than making it a percentage, which right now you have 25%, would be to change it to dwelling units per acre. And right now, in the different studies that we did and our recommendations, they're coming up between 25 and 35 units per acre. That's in terms of residential. And the reason why we think that the dwelling units per acre is a better way of doing it, and the committee can discuss it, is that it's giving you a better understanding of what you're getting, whereas a percentage is a little bit more ambiguous. This way you know exactly what kind of density you're getting, not depending on the size of the building that the developer is putting up. John, do you want to say something?
I think that well, first of all, we haven't met together for a while since the bowl that event that occurred, and so we've had the good fortune of having Melissa and Matthew do some terrific work, and the board has come together and shared a great deal of ideas with them, and they've tried to incorporate as much as possible. And we've all kind of done our due diligence in looking at some of the other municipalities and what they're doing since pretty much all of South Florida is sort of growing in leaps and bounds, and sort of analyzing our situation. And the way to do it is kind of comparing apples to apples, oranges to oranges. And in my own sort of private research, I've realized that some municipalities have an open-ended number of dwelling units per acre, up to about 135, 150, with height limitations that are, I don't even want to bring it up because it's a sore subject. But sort of analyzing where we've come from since the Banyan Bowl, where numbers were being sort of flexed of about 135 dwelling units per acre, which caused the sensation. We've come to some place where it seems like we could compare to other municipalities, and I'll read off kind of a list, but between 25 to 35, and at the stats, the situation now is we're at about 12. So we're sort of increasing it, but not compared to everyone else that's out there, all the other municipalities, and the ones that I sort of selected because I think that they're in the area and they're sort of comparable to us and what we're trying to do as an urban plan that is, I want to say, progressive enough to take into account the next 50 to 100 years. Right? I particularly looked at Pinecrest, City of Miami, Miami-Dade, Miami Beach, Coral Gables, Pembroke Pines, West Palm Beach, Boca Raton. All of those have major thoroughfares running through them. And some of them have a very high number of dwelling units. So, we've kind of come to that place where it seems like 25 to 35 might be the number, at least in dwelling units, as opposed to sort of this percentage-based thing of each building arriving at a number. I think that we, for the most part, all agree that warehousing cars on this major boulevard of ours is not the best use for the appearance that we would like for Pinecrest on what would be the sort of front elevation of the property. So, kind of kicking the ball around in our meetings, I think that the number of 25 would seem to be sort of a reasonable increase. So if 12 is representative of 25%, then 24, 25 would represent 50% perhaps, in a very sort of easy math to understand. And I'm saying that sort of globally to sort of put some perspective to it. I think that generally we all sort of agree that mixed use with residential is the future of the urban plans of cities. It's the most successful model, as opposed to separating occupancies, commercial over there, residential over here, for all sorts of reasons, including energy. So I think that there's a general sense that it makes an enormous amount of sense to go in that direction.
Hey, good morning. I am Jose Casanova. I am an architect and urban planner with over 30 years of experience in the public and private sectors, and intensive participating in hundreds of public meetings. I am very concerned about the planning process. You created a committee with professionals of the architect and landscape architect to provide input and recommendation to the council. However, we haven't had a chance to participate as a committee discussing ideas among ourselves. And this is really something that I am very concerned. I think there is a big lack. I don't believe that we are close to a plan yet. I think that we're making a lot of assumptions, and I think that we need more analysis, but especially we need to meet ourselves and discuss as a group, which I think that is what the intention becomes. Therefore, I am recommending that we add 2 more meetings, maybe modify the agenda, the timetable, and include 2 additional.
May I interrupt?
No.
We can't hear.
You cannot hold a meeting like this in this room.
Speak louder, please.
You cannot hear the people speaking.
Miss Attorney, please go get the sergeant's arm. One more outburst, and we'll find you.
Don't threaten me with that crap.
All right.
Little dictator.
There you go. Make it happen. Go ahead.
So basically, I'm recommending that we add 2 more meetings among just ourselves. If the body wants to comment at the end, they are welcome to it. But we need time for ourselves to discuss and create and bring with our own ideas rather than what other municipalities have done. I have worked in many municipalities, the consultants, the staff, and I never seen any commercial district without residential, that don't allow residential. The only exception is industrial districts that don't allow residential, and even we are considering industrial residential in some areas. But I strongly believe that the mixed use is the future. So again, I'm pleased considering the additional modification that
If you guys need more time to discuss it, I obviously think you should have as many meetings as you'd like to kick this around with yourselves and make sure you're as comfortable as possible with the recommendations. So that's, I'll leave that to you guys, what you're most comfortable with. I would agree, it's gotta be important.
We
Yes,
do
sir.
have another committee meeting scheduled for September 27th,
Okay.
and we can schedule another one.
I think what Mr. Castano is asking for is a discussion amongst themselves. Yeah, go. For
Well,
this
two things.
one.
We have one meeting scheduled this
In the back.
Thursday, correct? We have a meeting scheduled this Thursday.
There's a meeting with the village council tomorrow, and then there's a meeting with the committee scheduled for the 27th of September, and then the committee's term sunsets on the 30th. Unfortunately, the last meeting we had, even though there wasn't a quorum, Mr. Casanova was not there, it was very productive, and maybe we can meet with Mr. Casanova and bring him up to speed. We've also, when Victoria Trucco, for example, and Ronnie Matu were available at certain meetings, we asked them to provide their comments in writing, which they did, which was very helpful, and Mr. Casanova's done the same. But we are meeting on the 27th, and if we need to, we can
Okay,
maybe
so just
meet
as long as
again
you're all
before the
comfortable that
30th.
you have a conversation amongst yourselves and you've gotten that.
I don't think we have a right at the point. I think that we need to meet at least 2 more meetings among ourselves.
Okay, I'll let you all work that out amongst, and I don't want to dictate how this is done.
And perhaps.
Mr. Chair, if you don't mind speaking into the microphone, please, and just hold it straight so that it does
All right,
hold it up.
okay, like that?
No,
Are we good? Like this?
there you go. Making sure we have.
All right, so generally, I want to say that I enjoyed that this company, the Boots company, a great deal. And I think that there's been a degree of conversation that happened at the last meeting, which was that sort of that summary meeting where Melissa brought up all of these points. And we actually shared for the first time, and there was heated conversation as well as general conversation that, for the most part, everybody agreed upon. And I think that you know, kind of starting with what Melissa began with the current code. I think generally the board, as we spoke last week, and by the way, these meetings, Melissa, I think we were much more generous with my time because, or our time, that was a slip. Our time, we were probably putting in 4 to 4.5 hours per meeting.
Wow.
All right, so, you know, we probably have invested in this thing about 40 some hours, as well as all the personal research, as well as all of the presentations, and you've just only seen a summary sheet that they've put up, and some really great ideas came from that. But some points that I think that we could all agree on was, listen, the idea of 45 feet and 4 stories generally works. I don't think anybody disagreed with that. It still works with an increase in FAR and an increase in volume of residential. All right? And I think that for the most part, everybody agreed with that.
Is that right? So that's kind of the most
And I
controversial
think,
thing.
and I think there was no contention. I think Council Member Prado was there. She witnessed the conversation. It was a dialogue. It was back and forth. We all agreed to the hammock idea, the village idea of a green carpet, a canopy, that how much of that we could get into the highway. There were consensus points that in fact are positive, that continue to inspire, you know. I think that from the work that Melissa showed, which it's diagrammatic and very one-dimensional, the thing that sort of inspired me was the idea of a village center on 136th. And they actually did renderings of what that might look like. There was discussion, there was a great deal of back and forth. And in that back and forth, some of the ideas that came up of that was that we recognize there is an issue with transportation, the routes of people coming in and out. What would that do to the community? So some safeguards. What are some safeguards that if a property like that gets designed and built to create a city center, which provides perhaps a facility that's a little larger than this one for community interconnectivity, it would be to look at the safeguards of having the staff recommendations on proposed designs that would be over a certain acreage of property. Stefan actually spoke about that to a degree, and that in fact that's something that's already in play. When there's a proposal that is large enough, the committee has to get involved. The other ones that Ronnie, I think, brought up, and in fact I brought up for sure, is when a project is of a certain size, that we build a committee to review a project that's over a certain number of acres. And so there would be architects, engineers, landscapers, and so forth to come together to look at the design, to codify, and not to codify, but to kind of look at the design to see if it's something that, how it's going to impact the community. And of course, that would come with the environmental impact statements and analysis, as well as the transportation issues. And those would be all safeguards for the larger parcels. There seems to be like 5 parcels that really are the ones that are the potential economic drivers. The others are going to all sort of stay in the 4 to 5 story range. But those 5 are the specific ones that seem, when you really look at potential people that would invest in this community, it seems like there's 5 of them. And I think we've talked about them to death already. But it's how to control those where it would take advantage of that sort of capital opportunity to drive the economy in South Florida. We've talked about how to interconnect and do some of those things about with roads and highways and so forth. But I think that by virtue of us all being Coral Gables residents, Pinecrest residents, we would all like to enjoy Pinecrest, not go to Coral Gables. Why should I go to and John and I spoke about that briefly. Why do I have to, if I want to go out and have a drink or someplace, not have an atmosphere conducive to Pinecrest that I can sort of go to, sort of a city, a village center somewhere, where I can sort of sit around in a piano nobile and sort of enjoy the environment, the atmosphere of hammocks and things of that nature, that I'm not, in a sea of cars that have been, warehoused in front of me. It kind of takes away from the mood. I think that we can see something more powerful than sitting in front of a car at the local French bakery or French or Cuban bakery, and a sea of cars. Why can't it be a wonderful canopy of trees and landscape and so forth? And I think that I think that most of us, in fact all of us, would like to have an experience like that. We ride our bicycle there and we can We can sit in front of a shop and just sort of enjoy the time in this wonderful environment.
I got involved in this part because of my wife, part because of the neighborhood, part because I've lived here for a long time, and this is the business that I'm in, is planning and doing that kind of stuff. And when I got involved in this, there was all the alarm bells going off, right? And doing the multiple math of acres and how many units you could do and all this stuff. So it was a very alarmist kind of thing, and I look at it and go, yeah, that stuff only happens if economics allow it to happen and if the communities around it allow it to happen. So when I got involved, we were shown the old plan that was done in 2012. I thought there was a ton of good work and some very creative stuff done in that. So I think, well, when I looked at it, I go, gosh, we've got a really great starting point. Some things didn't get done. Some things were put in play, like the North District overlay that were put in play that nothing happened to it. And so some of these things were going on. And again, the killer words were mixed use and density. I mean, those were the alarm bells that were going off in the community. So in doing that, and with these guys helped and studied, we challenged them in a few places. One is knowing that we don't quite have agreement with the county to not impose their will completely on us, as long as we make an attempt to sort of rationalize these hubs in a way that's not exactly as it was. We don't just leave and say we're not doing anything, so we do something. So we looked at those opportunities and what that meant. And as soon as you say FAR, you've lost 90% of the community, of the crowd, right? They just don't get it, don't understand it. So I challenge these guys to take something and take this 0.73 and push it to 1 and demonstrate to the public and to us on the council, what does that look like? What does that mean? Because I knew if you walked into those two developments that you would perceptibly not know it. And what we found out about it through some of the planning studies and workshop is that if you change the underlying things that she spoke about earlier, about the way parking's corralled, the way open space is put together. They had done a plan that was, for me, I lived near the Ross thing up by Dairy Queen. They had done a plan, and I looked at it, I really liked it. I said, can we do this with the current zoning? And he said, no. And I said, why not? Because of the things that they brought up. So in and the same thing with percentages, I think those were, so I thought, yeah, let's say units, and in the end of the day, Pinecrest units will be bigger than other ones, so they'll be more expensive than other ones. So you're not gonna have this fear of all of a sudden we've increased the population by X amount of people that came in from the outside to buy Pinecrest. I see more, a little bit of people in Pinecrest having a place to stay and stay close to where they used to live, because of the way that economics will drive that. So anyway, I thought there was a lot of that stuff that was done. It was really, really well. I think that in the last meeting, what we said is, what does it take to modify our current zoning if we apply these business district overlays to all 3 nodes to allow for some good development to happen? Because the diagram, it's not up there now, but the diagram that she had showed the parking between the buildings and this and that. If you reinterpret it with exactly the same FAR, with exactly the same density, with exactly the same everything, but you loosen up those rules to allow for good planning, you get some interesting spaces with parks or courtyards or other spaces, and the parking sort of hidden, and things that do make an opportunity for us to create something that has a little bit of destination, a little bit of heart in it. So anyway, I think there's some good things. I think some things came out last week that they said they're not going to present today, but going to present, I think, at the meeting tomorrow and go through some of those things. But I think all these things, to me, helped ally the constituency, which is us, the people who live here, to say we're not trying to do anything crazy. Even when we went to 1.0 FAR, it didn't mean we needed to push the buildings taller. In fact, some things got a little bit weird because the buildings got too slender for their use and things like that. So 4 stories was really pretty good if we went to 1. And if you can use 1 as ammunition with the, with the county, then maybe we've solved a whole bunch of problems, right? We've got the opportunity to develop these things a little differently. We've allied the constituency that we're not building high rises and not going crazy and bringing in tons of density. And we can give people under new development or redevelopment concepts a better way to do it, and that might incentivize them to make destination in one of these parcels.
can I try to summarize, see if I'm correct? You guys tell me if I'm correct and if I'm interpreting what you're saying. What you're saying is that with minor changes to the existing zoning code, we could take something that exists around the Dayton Station, North Pinecrest District, implement it around the other two stations, which is consistent with our policy, their policy, and then tweaks to the code relative to open space parking location, parking garages, and even if you went to a 1.0 floor area ratio, you could still, those minor things, you still do that within a 4-story envelope and create the high-quality development that we've all been talking about, that we desire around here.
The plan they did by my house, I wish they do.
Okay, so
we couldn't do it under the zoning that exists.
Even
though we wouldn't be violating any of the parameters of the zoning, some of the complications of the zoning would be violated.
So the underlying code as it exists now, whenever it was constructed, really prevent us from high quality development. But we went back and we talked about in the first slide, Melissa, now we're talking about the high quality opportunities to shop and dine and those types of things. That seems to be more of an art than a science, right? That's an economics issue. What draws that? Is that high quality design? I mean, I think that with if you look at the zip code and the income level in the zip code, that would be attractive for high quality uses. But something's preventing it. And is that design? Is that the zoning code that's preventing it?
So one of the things that
If we could please use the microphone.
Do you want me to answer that?
Yeah, anybody who wants to answer it,
Okay.
should answer.
So what we found was that the way your code is currently written, specifically the parking requirements and the open space, are what affects the size of the building floor plate, right? So, imagine, you have an acre parcel and you can only build on a quarter of that because of the way that your code is written. I'm just making this up. This could be completely wrong. But just as a visual, your building is much smaller than the actual lot. And if you want to go back to that slide, I can maybe talk about it a little bit more clearly. But the way that they're requiring parking in between the buildings, you can't have a very large building. And the way you're requiring open space, this is the best possible layout.
And it's no good.
So what we did and what our designers did is they came up with different parameters. So we were asked to look at increasing the FAR, which is basically the total area that you can build in the building in comparison to the lot. Right now you can build up to 73% of the lot. And with FAR 1, it means you can build up to 100% of the lot. And what that means is the area of the lot is equal to the area of the building, and it can be configured in different ways. 1-story, 2-story, 3-story, 4-story. And then once you start overlaying all these different requirements, then you can't do it in 1 story, maybe you can do it in 2 stories. So we were looking at this higher area to be developed, and we were looking at what would it look like in 4 stories, what would it look like in 5 stories, what would it look like in 6 stories. We didn't look at the residential units as a limiting factor. It was really the FAR and the height. And then we started laying in different things like the open space and the parking requirements. And what we found is that we can bring these tomorrow. We wanted to focus today on the content of the recommendations. But what we found was that if you build to the floor area of 1, you don't need more than 4 stories. If you go up to 6 stories, your buildings get a little smaller and they don't have that, that cozy, comfortable feeling of space in the town center. So if you wanted to go taller, you would have to increase the area that you could build. And I'll get into that in the next couple of slides, but what we found in the community is that there was everybody 100% like the 4 stories, and then once you asked them about 6, it was a mixed bag. And of course, there's a constituent that is very much against it, but what we found is that you can do a really good development in the 4. And then if you want to incentivize different things, If you want to have underground parking, for example, if you want to have a certain kind of open space, if you want to have a certain kind of mix of uses, you have the option of starting to add bonuses. And that's maybe something that we can talk about today as well. So that's essentially what we found. Now, in terms of adjusting the zoning code, there are other things that you could tweak to make it better. So we look at, I'm just gonna move on.
But in a nutshell, what you're saying is we can, my concern initially with wanting to discuss flexibility and its height is so that we could get better quality design in open space. What you're saying is that you can get better quality design in open space without height. In fact, the height may be negative. What fixes it are rearranging the way we do parking open space, the way we calculate it in this very, I guess, prescriptive Euclidean or performance-based code, right? By tinkering that, making it more contemporary, you don't have to mess with the other things.
And also with the residential.
Adding
So
residential.
right now, if you can only, the way developers build, if only a quarter of the building on the upper level stories can be residential, then it doesn't work. So the number of dwelling units is too low as well.
I'd just like to mention something.
I think the plan I see is that you need more open spaces, because just focusing just on the building and the parking lot should not cut it. The other comment, Chair said, the trend in North America globally is mixed-use development. That's not true. The trend is mixed-use development, open spaces, and walkability. Those are the three trends going in North America and globally. So I think the plan has to focus on that, so that we have proportional open spaces, proportionally, the FAR. So we have all the corners are done. And the second,
We can hear. Thank you for your
and the second thing I would say, what Jose was talking about, maybe we have to meet privately already, and we're going to hash out some of these issues, and then come up with the joint front that can be part of the Pinecrest. Because otherwise, I think we're going to miss that. It might be a few people's opinion, and then we might not be cutting it off. So I think I spoke what Jose said. Let's meet privately. And I know it's very hard to meet all of us. It's not easy. So last week I got COVID, and I know I'm okay. So it was kind of tough.
So I'd like to, Mayor, you asked a specific question. Why not? Why can't it get done? Right? What's preventing the good design? And having had, either the good fortune or the bad fortune to work with a lot of developers in my career, there are certain
Yeah.
Go ahead, she were just technically.
there are certain feasibilities that have to underpin a project, and you're going to attract good design by bringing good developers to Pinecrest if there are incentives for that to happen. But there's no incentives because we're sort of dragged down with the past as to the theories of the past, which was the car and warehousing a car, making things utilitarian in nature and not necessarily beautiful in nature. The past designs in urban planning were oftentimes caught up with the functionality of the automobile. And from my perspective, and maybe others on the board believe this or not, I think we need to move away from that and take that functional component and make it secondary to the urban experience. So how do you manage to do that if you are a developer? Well, you have to have you have to do a feasibility study in which you can determine those components that make it workable. And those things that make it workable are the number of parking spaces is going to determine the number of units. And the number of units is what's going to pay the developer to do all the good work. So you have to have the right ratio of parking to how much you can make per unit, and what is a number of units that the developer will say, yeah, I can make a profit, take all the risk in the world, and make those two things work, that takes into account the variable of the FAR, and that it's a reasonable FAR, and that it's not limited by some kind of cap in height that prevents you from doing the project. And so one of the things that we spoke when I was just talking to you over coffee one day, I said, you know, at some point, how do you convince the community of something like this where you have to vet all these ideas, right? And I think that Melissa did these wonderful schemes that we all looked at and said, wow, that could be really cool. I like that a lot. That would be really nice. But to test out how you can make something feasible, you sometimes have to bring, create some sort of charrette that you allow people to test the model you set in place. And you allow the community to look at it. And in there you can see the good and the bad. Because there may be loopholes. We're very talented. This group here is very talented, very good design, very good designers, very good designers. And you guys are very talented, thoughtful people. But we may miss something. So there has to be at least a step or two to vet the ideas and say, okay, an open charrette. Everybody gets to come up with their a design, and let's see what's the good and the bad of all these concepts that we brought to light. But there are those variables of height, FAR, dwelling units, residential dwelling units in regards to the piano nobile, which is the ground floor, the colonnade where you sit outside amongst the trees, and you can have all the courtyards in the world, but if the project can't fly, it's not going to happen. Yeah, I would love the European model of all the courtyards, but then you have to take into account that parking has to happen somewhere else. And and you have to plan for that, because if not, you're going to have cars parked in everybody's backyard. Like, you remember the Orange Bowl, when you couldn't get, it was kind of fun, though, but you have to admit that it was a little problematic. How do we incorporate that parking component with the FAR, height restrictions, setbacks, and that it's not draconian?
Now, have you done that?
That falls into the model of square foot value. How much can you make? And that's what's going to attract the developer that will be interested in the property, and a potential seller of the property to someone to do something better with the property than just warehousing cars.
But your schemes, your schematics have taken into account the fact that you can hide the parking in structures or elsewhere or below ground without needing to go over 45 feet. Okay, well, that's pretty.
Okay, so let me just clarify. We're covering some stuff that's in the presentation. I just want to clarify. If we had a conversation at the last meeting, which was 4 stories and really 51 feet. So there's nuances and things that need to be adjusted for more modern and current needs of a developer. But what I do want to say is that on our team is a design firm, MKSK, and they've done a considerable amount of work in terms of analyzing those 3 sites. They looked at all 3 sites, they did the analysis of the existing zoning, then they looked at different iterations of what could be built on that site. As I said, with the 1.0 FAR, they even looked at if you adjusted it for 4 stories to 6 stories. And that's what was presented at some of the meetings and at the visioning session, different concepts. Some of them, the one at 136th Street, which is the Home Depot site, we looked at it 3-dimensionally, and we did a 6-story, we did a 4-story. What happens when we present that information is that becomes the focus of the entire discussion. So right now we wanted to get through this, and tomorrow we can provide that information, having already gone through this exercise. And all the information has been presented to the public as well. So everybody, and it's on your website, so all that information is available if people want to refresh their memory. But, yeah.
Yeah, Melissa, one of the concerns has been that if the density will be increased, FAR 0.73 to 1 or whatever, citizens want to see black and white, what impact that is going to do with the traffic, especially the surrounding communities. I think he brought that up today also, I forgot the name of the gentleman. And we talked about this 3-4 meetings. So I think we need some drawings that can tell us, black and white, what impact the increment of the FAR is going to do, so that the citizen can see, because that's one of their fear. Hey, traffic is going to be a lot, more going to get to the public, the center is coming. We need some drawings, some sections.
So if I could just stop you right there, just for clarification. This is our 6th meeting, right? This is our 6th meeting with the committee members.
Seven meetings. Today's the
7,
second.
okay. We did 5 committee meetings since June. We had 1 visioning session, which many of the committee members attended, and then we have this meeting. Unfortunately, not all of the members were able to actively participate. Some of them have shared their ideas offline, and I know we haven't been able to get as much input from you because we didn't have as much participation. But there are several committee members here that have attended every meeting, and out of consideration for them, I think we should acknowledge that and acknowledge the fact that we have had opportunities to present a lot of information, a lot of drawings, specific to and gotten their input. This is another opportunity to do that. But in terms of the traffic studies, that is a separate item that's not part of what we were tasked to do. Yeah.
But I think it's a very important task. I don't know if you're tasked or not, but I think most of the citizens are very afraid of the traffic issue. If what we're talking here is going to happen, so I think it becomes our duty, council's duty, our duty to make sure that kind of drawings or schematics are provided to the citizens so they can see. Maybe the fear is nothing. I mean, if you ask me as a professional, I would say that traffic is not going to be a problem. But I think we have to provide a visual experience so we can do. I don't know if it's your task, we have to hire somebody else, I don't care. I think that process has to go.
What I can tell you is that because we're recommending, and the recommendation and the analysis is to increase units and development around these transit hubs, you can control the traffic in terms of the people that are there with your parking counts and reducing the parking ratios, and the conventional thinking and the philosophy of transit-oriented development is that the people living around the transit stations will not have cars, or they'll have fewer cars. So the assumption is just that, but the traffic study would allay people's allay the ambiguity and sort of clarify that. I agree.
Thank you.
I want to make a comment. Basically, I am not afraid of higher FAR. And also I believe that we need to develop at least one alternative with higher FAR to say, well, this is not what we want, but we at least analyze this condition. Also based on my professional experience dealing with development and quality of development, you need to provide a lot of incentive. If you want good development and amenities, this goes through incentive, and I have used that before. And that means that you start with the basic FAR, and if they provide an open courtyard, then you provide them an incentive to higher in the building structure. We need to provide parking for future residents of Pinecrest, which I think that they will do transit in the future. Where are they going to park? If they want to go to 136th Street, they come from Pinecrest and they need to parcel place their cars to go to the rail. I don't think that these have been considered. Also, I believe that the stadium are going to have a significant impact in Pinecrest, and I would like to see rendering how the county planner, what have they done in terms of 3D presentation. And I think that we need to have a presentation from the county planning department or rail to show us what they have done. Because if it's going to have a significant impact, it will affect us. In addition, I believe that we need to look into further analysis of the area of 104th Street. I believe I see some deficiencies there, and I believe that it's a conflict between the commercial and the residential, and I foresee changes in land uses, and I think that need to be analyzed.
Well, this is good.
Yeah, let's go, okay. Okay, so what I'd like to do, because there's been a lot of discussion, I'm gonna run through the slides rather quickly, and then after that, we can have a discussion, and each committee member we'll just go down the line, and everybody can kind of share their thoughts. It might be the most efficient way, unless anybody has a different suggestion. Okay. Is the mic picking my voice?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So remember from the beginning when we started the presentation, there were the 7 themes. So we went through the first one and we had a really nice, robust conversation. So let's go back to the theme. So the second theme, which is a lot of what we touched on, was about developing a clear framework for new development. And what we found was that we want to have specific guidance for areas around the stations and along the corridors. There's almost 2 different treatments. So in terms of the transit overlay areas, and if we want to rename them, you know, here's an idea, TOAs. I don't know what people think about that. But what came out of the meeting last week was that the city center is a good idea at 136th Street. And I would say that in all of the committee meetings and the visioning session, people agreed that something could happen at 136th Street if it was done in a considerate way of the community and all the other things that we talked about. Just in terms of our recommendations, in terms of uses, we want to encourage a mix of uses to replace the single-use zoning. We talked about increasing the FAR per the county, and the county's requested at 1.0. Remember, FAR is the area that you can build in comparison to the lot size. In terms of the height, so this goes back to some of the things that we were talking about per floor. The recommendation is that the first floor is 15 feet in height. And that just allows for typically what the typical architectural design and the needs of modern uses is a higher first floor. That's for loading trucks, that's for just the open space, and you'll see all the new products that are out there. The first floor is taller than the other floors. And then the subsequent floors would be 12 feet in height, which would get you to 51 feet if you're working with 4 stories. Right now you have 45 feet. We also had a,
So we're talking about really just a 6-foot increase.
correct. The second point is that right now your height is based on the peak of the roof. So in terms of the commercial structures, we wouldn't use that as the measure of the height. The height would be to the top of the floor. You know, when you talk about floor height, it's floor to ceiling. We decided to remove, so we added layers of things that would help in terms of the measurements, and one of them is floor plate. We decided that floor plate is just, you know, your footprint of your floor, and sometimes that's a way to kind of limit and control what's built. but we decided as a committee that that wasn't something that we felt was necessary, and it might be too restrictive for a designer. We think the existing setbacks are sufficient the way you have them, so we wouldn't make any changes to the setbacks. But what we do want to tinker with a little bit is the parking and require parking behind buildings or structured parking, even shared parking, and you look at the changed parking ratios. We really think that some of the parking ratios should be addressed and reduced, especially around these transit areas. In terms of the parcels fronting the parkway, we would look at the uses. Again, the height, 4 stories, 51 feet. And then in terms of the last bullet addresses some of the transportation. So one of the people on our team has an expertise in transportation planning, and his recommendations were to have specific updates in terms of the connectivity and access, signalization and egress controls, and that would help in terms of accessing the parcels and addressing some of the stacking and loading issues on the streets. He felt like there was an opportunity to address that, and that would also improve some of the issues with traffic and congestion. The next one is about architecture and defining the parameters for great architecture. We had this debate, you can't define great architecture, should we have a style? Kind of gone back and forth. What we can do is have a series of design standards that will kind of elevate the quality and the expectation of what you have. So transparency, which is essentially the glass and what you can see in the building, that makes a building more alive and attractive, but also we want to have a limitation on the transparency because we want it to be thoughtful and considerate because of our climate. So having trees and having canopies and things that would block and protect from the sun. I have to say that for Victoria Juco because she's not here, but that was her comment. In terms of parking structures, we're suggesting that you have a treatment for your parking structures, and that the parking structures are important in terms of these denser developments around the transit stations, but they have to be done in a way that's thoughtful and doesn't encroach and sort of impose negatively on the surrounding area. And one of the ways to do that is to create liners, and a liner is simply a use that fronts that parking garage, so it could be commercial, it could be residential, but it covers the actual structure of the garage, so you don't see it as a parking garage. So for example, the picture above, behind that could be a parking garage. That's Cocoa, part of it is parking, but you don't see that there's a structure there because it's programmed with usable space. Building articulation, which is really just how you horizontally and vertically. This is a little technical. How you modulate the building. So it's just the design. But you look at the building on top, and it's interesting. And why it's interesting is because you have different setbacks. You have the horizontal piece. You have a vertical piece, and those are things that you can write into your code so that you have more interesting buildings. Building length, building separation. We talked about separation and how that impacts buildings. Blank walls. So there's lots of examples of structures that have a complete blank wall. We don't want that because that creates a dead street. Active ground floor uses. So that's really at your ground floor that you have uses that are open to the public. So you might have restaurants, you might have retail, you might have offices, but it's things that are public. And so you want to have on the ground floor active uses so that you can create that town center feeling. In terms of materials, we want to look at opportunities for changing the building materials. So on the parkway, is there a standard of building materials that we can employ? Coral rock, different things we talked about that are specific to Pinecrest, and that would give it a specific character. And we also went back and forth on who will enforce the criteria. So once we work through all these measurable design criteria, and thank you for bearing with me because I know it's kind of technical, who's going to enforce these criteria? And we did go back and forth on a design. Do we want to have a design review board? Perhaps we can have a design review board for projects of a certain size. If we have a public hearing for these larger projects so that there's public input. And I think what we came up with was that we do want to have some kind of design review process, but we want to have a threshold for size. So if it exceeds 4 acres, and if it exceeds 5 acres, your home Depot site, I think your Dayland site was 19, and your Home Depot site was more than 30. So you can kind of look at those as a threshold for when you would bring in a design review. And then, do we want to add incentives? And we don't have necessarily, we didn't have a lot of discussion about this, but if you have your base of 4 stories, do you want to allow and incentivize specific things like underground parking, more tree canopy, which is something that you can build right into the code as a requirement, specific kinds of articulation, this idea of the colonnade on the ground floor. What are the things that are most important to the village? And then is it worth incentivizing? By incentivizing, say, if you provide this, if you provide a certain type, if you provide underground parking, which is an additional expense, we would give you an extra floor in height. So there was discussion about that and what would be the right incentive. And I don't feel like we had necessarily agreement on that, but there definitely seems to be consensus that there should be an opportunity to incentivize some of these developments and some of the things that we want to see. The reason why you would have underground parking is because it creates more opportunity for uses on the ground floor and in the building, and it doesn't take away from the public spaces. But if you did increase the height, you would have to allow more area to be built, because what we said was that the FAR 1 works with 4 stories, it doesn't work with 6. So if you wanted to have a bonus, you'd have to look at increasing. And we have some studies that show that as well. We go to the next slide. Enhancing the public realm around the train station. So this image on the top right is one that we got a lot of positive feedback from at the visioning session. And these are the kinds of spaces that when we talk about public spaces, town center, this is really what we're envisioning. And that's with clear standards of code and open space. So one of the things that we can look at, what we're suggesting, is having specific standards for open space and percentages of open space, requiring courtyards, arcades, plazas, pocket parks, seating, public art, shade, signage, and wayfinding. And then all of these things would have more specific standards. And that would make sure that the spaces that people are building, the open space, it's not leftover space, which is what happens with what we have now, but it's meaningful spaces that people are using, that they can enjoy, like the one you see at the top right. And so when you start to aggregate all of those open spaces, and this is what came out of the committee meeting last week, you're going to get a better development. In terms of streetscape standards around stations, we had a lot of good input from a committee member who encouraged more of a natural landscape, and he talked about staggering trees to create more of a natural canopy, and also connecting pedestrian pathways. So in your last plan, there was a concept of having a road that went along the backs of the parcel of Pinecrest Parkway. And that hasn't been implemented yet, but we can put in standards and codes, and that could even be something when we talk about incentives, to build that pathway and to have connections. And that's what we talked about with connectivity, and looking at minimum sidewalk widths and lighting. Go to the next slide. We talked about transition areas, so this is a graphic that shows what we mean by transition and buffer. And so you have a gradation of height, so you have the taller buildings closer to the street, and then as you go back to the residential neighborhoods, it steps down, you have that transition. And that's really important. We do support existing setbacks on multi-level buildings, and we think that's sufficient the way way it's written now to protect the buildings. We support the existing front, side, and rear setbacks. The idea is that you can require townhouses or lower density residential on the backs of some of these commercial parcels around the transit stations. And that would create a buffer. So you have your single family, and then imagining where the Home Depot site is, where that parking area is, you could have townhouses. So you have sort of a stepping up instead of just a tall building. And so you wouldn't see any of the development, and it would be a nice transition. And that's really, really important to emphasize. We also are recommending landscape buffers in the rear, because that would also provide additional canopy and buffering. And then this came up at some of the meetings about noise and activity behind buildings, some of your existing buildings, some of your existing shopping centers, that the activity that's happening behind those buildings is a nuisance. It happens at all times of day. It can be loud. So some of the things you can do in your code for the existing buildings is to look at the hours of operations for loading and trash removal during, having that during the day at specific times. Having loading occur internal to the building for new building structures. And a parking structure in a courtyard. This is for new developments. So anything new would not impose any kind of noise or nuisance to the surrounding neighborhood. So everything would happen inside the building. And limitations on noise of air conditioners within a time frame for compliance. So that's something that we heard, I think it was this, I can't remember which plaza it was, but there are things right now that you have that aren't working that you could look at sunsetting. Within 2 years you need to upgrade your air conditioning units or buffer them in some way so that it's not a nuisance to the people that live there now. Next slide. I just have 2 more, and then we can discuss. I appreciate you letting me get through this. Can you? Oh, okay. And then we talk about the character and brand of the parkway. And what came to light was, and we had a really good discussion about this last week, was the trees and specific kinds of trees, the pine trees, the saw palmettos, longleaf pines, and the idea of clustering some of these trees in the centers of the median. And so we started off by talking about flipping the sidewalks, having the sidewalk, having the street, then having the trees, and then having a sidewalk, and what that would mean in terms of access and easements on private property. But it would agree that the sidewalk should be right next to the street. There should be landscape strip next to the street, and then a sidewalk on the other side so that people feel comfortable walking. We also talked about having a demonstration project for the new streetscape at Wayside Park, because that's obviously publicly owned, and you can look at flipping what you have now, so the parking and the sidewalk and the landscape will be flipped. And we also
We'll go inside the park, the sidewalk, and then along US1 would be grass or green. Because nobody wants to walk right next to this car.
Yeah, I actually did it and questioned my sanity. Then the other idea that we had was creating kind of a signature yellow sidewalk for Pinecrest. Something that's distinct to Pinecrest, that people would know that it's they're in a special place, different place. We talked about sign standards, and you have pretty good sign standards now that are working in terms of the height. The lower signs allow for more tree canopy, and the trees don't interfere with the signs, so you can see both the signs and the trees. Developing lighting standards. And we did have an interesting conversation at the median. So the village has jurisdiction over the medians. You're responsible for the medians on Pinecrest Parkway. And there's opportunities to do some really nice things in the median. I know this is part of your plan, your original plan. We haven't talked about why that hasn't been implemented, but we do think that there's opportunities as you enter the community. So the north and south, they have these clusters of trees. So we talked about saguaro palms, longleaf palms at Keno's, an entrances, some kind of special public art or an obelisk made of coral stone. We did have a suggestion about having an entrance at all East Bush streets, but there wasn't consensus on that. But the idea is that something can be done with the median, something can be done on the side of the streets, with landscaping, with sidewalks that create this character and feel and overall look for Pinecrest, so people know, oh, I'm in Pinecrest. This is a beautiful place, and it reflects what happens on the other side of US1 to the east. Because what you have on the east is beautiful. You have gorgeous trees, you have beautiful streets, you have beautiful homes. And the minute you get to US1, it completely changes and doesn't need to be that way. So let's take what you already have, what you've already established your character, and bring that to the parkway. Talked about open space. At a minimum 25% regardless of use, and we'll work on the open space standards and even looking at bonuses for certain types of open spaces. So if you wanted to have a big park on a corner, a big wide space as people are driving in, is that something that we would want to provide a bonus for? And then the last slide, enhancing connectivity for pedestrians and bicycles. So this gets into more of the sort of the measurable standards. If you have standards for streets and block sizes, and what we call like a hierarchy or a ranking of streets, you start to create a language and try not to use too much jargon, but you start to create a visual expectation of a community. So if you think about your favorite downtown city. You have your wide main street, you have your side streets, you have your favorite shopping streets, and the zoning and the requirements for these streets are different. So you have different requirements for your sidewalk, for your landscaping, and actually for your uses. So when I talked before about the ground floor uses, you have different percentage requirements depending on the type of street. When we talked about parking structures, you don't want your entrance to the parking structure on the street where all the people are walking. You want it on the side, you want it on the back street. So creating avenues, primary pedestrian streets, secondary streets, residential streets, and eastern edge alleyways, and a block size starts to create that town center. So all of the drawings that we produced show these different block sizes, and that's really important because that's also what's going to drive the sense of place and this desire to walk around. Because if you think of your favorite place to go, and it has a specific block size, and it has a specific street size, and everything was developed with a particular thing in mind. So here you have the opportunity to put that in your code, and we call that street hierarchy. There is an opportunity, and another idea is incentives for dedicating right of way for new streets. Somebody owns an entire parcel and you want them to create blocks, does the village want to take ownership of those streets? If they do they want to provide an incentive for dedicating that right of way? That's something to think about. And then having standards for loading and driveways. We talked a little bit about that in some of the previous slides, what you have now, so that you ensure that you don't have too much stacking, you don't have interfering with the turning movement of people coming into a parcel to go out onto US1, so all that needs to be resolved. And then standards for sidewalks and trails. You've been playing around with some of these numbers. You want to have a wide sidewalk where you want to have most of your people walking 12 to 16 feet. And then on a secondary street where you're going to have less walking, but you're still going to have activity, it can be narrow, it can be 8 to 12 feet. And so we would build these standards so that it's not just the architecture, but it's also the streets and it's also the landscape and the streetscape. So it all works together to create a cohesive concept. And then finally, again, just to reiterate this idea of having connections through multi-use paths. So multi-use path is bicycle, pedestrian, but connecting back to the residential so that people have the opportunity to walk from their house, if it's not too far and the weather permits, to get to these places because right now, from what we understand, it's not conducive to any of those activities. It's just much safer and more comfortable to drive. So these are the standards, these are the recommendations that we had. This is what we presented last week to the committee. Everything that's underlined are new ideas that we added, and crossed out were things that there wasn't agreement on. And so if the committee, does the committee want to go and provide comments on this? Or does it's your meeting, I don't know who would like to speak.
Yeah, you know, since I got on this committee, I've been looking very closely at US1 and the sidewalks. And I was the one that thought Wayside Park of bringing the sidewalk in, coming in, and then how we can maybe make these connections on the backside. Because no one really wants to walk on US1 anyways. And we're not bringing the people who live in Pinecrest in. So then I look where the duplexes are, and maybe that's a place where we could do a nice broad sidewalk that sort of collect people. And then we, like where the tag agency is, do a little break there, you know, so it goes through the parking lot. And, you know, on the backside here from 120th to the park, the city owns a pretty substantial chunk all along the roadway. So if that had a nice wide sidewalk. And also I've been looking at new places that have kind of come in since we've been Pinecrest. You have like the Dixie Shopping Center, the Publix, the Polo Tropical, and there's no connection. Like, you know, if you're in Home Depot and you want to go to Polo Tropical, it's a hedge. I mean, each one could have sacrificed a parking space and did a ramp, so it connects. Because a lot of this stuff is going to come in time. It's not going to be one big chunk. It's going to be little pieces. So for me, how do we, when all these little pieces come in, that we sort of create a situation where they're feeding. And I think if we do have some kind of nice wide sidewalk on the Pinecrest side, and then say, okay, whenever new development comes in, like where the farm stores is, and the veterinarian, that little spot, that instead of turning your back on Pinecrest, you open yourself up. Maybe the restaurant is open to 82nd instead of US1. And then people can walk through there. And then, so, you know, I'm trying to think of what the logical, how things would come together, and how maybe in the code we can address some of these things, so as these pieces come together, they sort of, you know, fit in with the puzzle.
Would we address those things in the code itself, or at the time of development? How would we put those aspects in the code so that we let them? I'm sure we want flexibility with the development. How does it work?
But you know, I was almost wondering, what if like Pinecrest stepped in and said, okay, let's do from the Toyota, let's try to where we have control, let's make it nice, and then sort of do the spine, and then let the developers, when they come in, they have to tap into that.
Okay, so we would put the initial concept together, and as those developments came in over time, we would ask them to connect as part of the development.
And I sort of brought the idea of like the yellow sidewalk, because and I go to like Giralda and Coral Gables, and they have the yellow, and it's been holding up very well through the years. The yellow, and the yellow at night would be bright enough to where, and maybe the yellow sidewalk crosses the road.
Yeah.
Killian, 124, 120th, you have that weird parcel of land behind the gas station. Maybe the city can buy that and create, and then have that feed into the other shopping center where the IHOP is. Because if you're at the IHOP and you decide you want to have a Pinecrest bakery, you got to go to US1. You can't go to the back. You got to do that weird little jog, and it's an unsafe intersection anyways, even for driving. I'm just curious that if Pinecrest were to step in and say, okay, you know, let's lay the groundwork for these developments, you know, on our end, and then you need to tie into that. So when the Dixie Belle has their parking garage, because I've lived here all my life, and I don't even know how to get into the Dixie Belle from the 82nd Avenue.
I don't think it has an entrance.
You know, yeah, I think it does. I think it does, but you can't find it. It's really weird. And then how, when they did the Dixie Belle, it doesn't connect to the Daily Bread. if you're at Daily Bread and then you want to go to the Dixie Shopping Center, you have a full hedge, you got to walk to US1.
What's funny is that when we did the previous plan in 2012, I think we were looking at the Publix coming in, we were talking about cross-access easements so that we could get across. There's a lot of resistance to it from the property owners as well, but you're right, it would help traffic flow, I think, so you didn't have to get onto US1. Every time you went to a different use, you'd stay within the commercial corridor. That alone might ease traffic significantly.
Well, yeah, it would help with it, and it would just make us who live here a better experience. Of
Right.
being able to kind of go from one place to another.
We changed in our code. If they redevelop, they have to have a cross-section.
But
It's already in our code,
okay,
we changed.
but the Polo Tropicalan end, there's no.
Dixie
there's
Bell
no-
just fell under, they got in before.
Under the wire.
And actually, one of the biggest opponents against it was one of the sites where, like, the Home Depot owners spoke in the public hearing, were adamantly opposed to cross-section through.
Yeah, it would help. That's a great idea.
Well, you see all the workers going to Polo Tropical, and then they have to cut through the hedge, and people at Home Depot going to Publix. I see them with the Publix bags coming back to the Home
Yes.
Depot, and yet we have no, and there's a little swale, there's a little part there that's open where they could even provide handicap ramps.
Right.
Through from one side to the
Great
other.
idea.
But I think the city should just step in and say, look, you're required to do this. I mean, somehow all the owners of Sunny Lake Shopping Center got together and have one sidewalk that cuts across like 10 owners, and it's the same sidewalk.
Mhm.
So I don't know why now we can't force people to somehow make a connection.
Thank you.
Is that because of liability that they did, the Home Depot didn't want to have the cross access?
He didn't want to give up anything. He said, "It's my parking lot, and I don't want to," I mean, pull a public hearing, he spoke, he said he was just adamantly opposed to that. And we were even looking at our code at the time to making it mandated, where after, like sunsetting it, like
Right.
5 years, I think the number was, after 5 years, but that didn't fly, because some of it was because he stood up and spoke. And it didn't pass because
But it is a requirement that's being implemented.
if you redevelop only.
Okay, good.
Who owns the sidewalk, who maintains the sidewalk on our side, out of US1?
FDOT sidewalk.
DOT, isn't it?
FDOT now, have we, FDOT be contacted to see what happens if we expand sidewalk another 10, 15 feet, who's going to maintain?
I'm sorry, it would have to
In
be-
a case in which FDOT say, well, you widen, this is your baby, you maintain it.
Right.
I think that's what they
That's
would do.
correct, that's what they would do. Yeah, we would have to do an easement, a sidewalk easement, but it would now become the village's responsibility.
Yeah, I don't see why any fatal flaws in being able to do that. They wouldn't tell us no. They would just make us.
I think Wayside Park would be an interesting little start, just to see how it works, and maybe it comes to the corner and then it comes over to the other spot where it can cross the.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I mean, like you were saying, we need to show people what this stuff looks like. That may be a great opportunity to do.
I'd like to just make, I know we're going to about 11 o'clock, so just some remarks that are more from my perspective as an architect. And I'm just going to throw them out at you, that you appreciate them for a moment. If you allow architects, if you allow designers to be creative, and you don't create rules that are so closed-minded that they can't think out of the box to make something better, you're going to get precisely what you want, which is stifled design opportunities, right? So for instance, when Melissa was talking about increasing the ground floor to a specific number, 15 feet, I would tell you, look, the base of the building may be what would create imagine a column, the capital, the shaft, and the base. I'm sure you've seen enough columns where something looks wonky, right? The base is either too thick, too big, or something. There's a proportion that has to do with the base, and that's usually 1.5 stories. So if the other stories are 12 feet or 15 feet, that's 1.5 stories or whatever that is. And so there's this correlation and a relationship that works into the capital of the building, you know? And so, hard and fast numbers may resolve our situation right now, but we have to have a certain amount of the ability to understand that you may be straitjacking certain designers from doing some creative work. They're just caught between the lines, right?
John, is what is being suggested here too prescriptive, or do you feel like
I think we're on our way.
Okay.
I think we're on our way to the right answers. And I don't think that there's any hard and fast. We weren't able to make any decisions because we didn't have quorum at the last meeting where we sort of summarized all these ideas. Melissa has a ton of drawings and tons of stuff that she's shown that were really inspiring. Okay, but I do think that I like the idea. I like the idea very much, and I was the one that brought up the idea of incentives, right? And I'm not saying these should be the incentives, but in my simple-minded or simplest way of looking at it, I said, okay, so if I were to prioritize stuff that I know a designer would appreciate, how would I, and that I can correlate with what we would like to see in Pinecrest. And I haven't, I shared this briefly at the last meeting with Melissa. She picked up on it. I call them incentives. She called them bonuses, tomatoes. I don't, but how can I get creative people to think about the problem and allow them to be creative and trust them? You have to trust that it's for the greater glory. So I wrote them in an order, and just bear with me, let me just get through all of them, and then you could disagree or not, but at least these are my thoughts. I said incentives and bonuses, piano noble, 1.5 stories, podium and colonnades. If you provide that, you get the increase in height that you want. We already have a code that's generally okay. We can tweak it, increase it some. I think that we should do that. But let's say you want to increase that first story to what everybody wants. Well, I call it piano noble. I don't call it the ground floor because piano noble suggests a European colonial model of using the promenade, that not the promenade, but that courtyard experience. Right? One level underground parking, by the way, costs a fortune. Costs a fortune. It has to get incrementally increased, carried by each one of the unit owners that's going to use the parking space. So underground parking, 1 floor, you get a floor. 2 floors, you get 2 floors. Nobody, I haven't seen anyone do more than 2 floors. Or 2 levels. They call them levels, but it's pretty much 2 floors. They're tighter spaces, right? Green canopy. You buy those mature banyan trees that have a caliper 10 feet that costs $100 and some thousand a piece. Hey, and you give me enough of those, I'm going to give you 4. Okay, you got to ship those signature trees from all over the wherever they're available. You pick them up and you bring them here. I'm going to give you 4. Vertical articulation, the facades. You give me wedding cake on the backside that represents a true genuflection to the residential neighbor. That's a single story, a 2-story, and you give me that wedding cake effect, give you 4. And I'm playing now, okay? So mind you, I'm being very, very generous in the conversation because these are big ideas. Horizontal articulation, okay? You give me a penthouse floor that's a green space that I could look up from above and have restaurants up there, and it's a canopy with beautiful trees, and you know what I'm talking about, all right? And I've seen that in New York City, and I've seen them across the country, and everybody loves that space. And let's talk about the High Line, right? You could take something that's absolutely horrible and create it a destination. So If you could do the High Line in New York, ending at a museum, then you can do some spectacular stuff. Give you a floor, right? Avenues, streets, and paths with all of that wonderful interconnectivity, and you can create those pathways that lead to boulevards and streets, and you color code them and so forth. I'll give you credit. I'll give you half a story. Maybe the penthouse will grow a little bit more, and I'll give you a few more units. Public art. You give me 2% public art, I'm going to give you something back. Right? There's a lot of artists in Pinecrest that need some work, and I think it's a great model. It's happening all across all the municipalities, and you see art in public places, and I think it's fabulous. And it could really be a way of distinguishing ourselves and appreciating what we see. And then I would establish a cap, because there might be a loophole that we missed. I've looked at all of 8 different communities. I'm not saying we are those communities. I don't want to be like those communities. But I've looked at 8 of them, and I've seen heights that can go 60 stories and so forth. When I kind of get down to it, I would establish a cap and say, okay, you can't get more than 100 feet. Why? Particularly because I know that Coral Gables is 150 feet, and then they grow to 275 feet and so forth, similar circumstances to us. But I would establish some kind of cap as a limitation so that there could never be some kind of breakout of some sort. More than likely, we'll never get to it, but at least it's there in the code, and it becomes the maximum. Whatever that might be. I said 100 feet because 100 feet really gives you nine floors. It doesn't give you 10 floors. When you take out all the slabs and all the stuff in between, you're not going to get that. You're going to get a little less than that. I agree with the issue of traffic and traffic flows. Every project, because you don't know where the access points are going to be, requires a traffic study. But one of the things that we can do, because there is great fear, and by the way, I'm not a proponent of designers working with fear as the great motivator. I believe that a designer has to be visionary and throw those ideas out there and get the idea out, but that the fear doesn't restrict them. Right? So I agree there is a problem with traffic. We all agree to that. So the city may want to be proactive and do a traffic analysis and establish some boundaries that maybe we have to change the way our city works and how streets work, and have that conversation as a separate topic. I believe with Melissa that it's a different subject. Maybe she wasn't tasked to study it, but that's a very complicated problem. And it requires a great deal of study on its own nature. So that should be something that we should do as a city, but individually, every project that comes along that's greater than, let's say, 4 acres or 2 acres, I don't know what the number should be. There's a traffic study assigned to it, and it's evaluated. And staff takes a look at it, the community takes a look at it, we all take a look at it. So I think traffic becomes one of those things that we always have to have present in our mind, that we're like, our miracle mile is really this high traffic zone that you can't go slow. But if we could improve it, I think that Melissa's comment about the operation of the traffic equipment and how to kind of work that better, we can become a little more efficient. But maybe we need to change the directionality of certain roads, of certain streets. Create more buffers, close off some streets. I'm not sure the other communities that have done it. Miami Beach has done it, Coral Gables has done it, those communities have done it where they were getting these transients coming through. So I think that the traffic issue, I agree with my colleague at the end of the table that I also forgot your name, so forgive me. But
call me Omar.
So I would tell you that traffic is a fear, but I think we can convert it as a positive and be proactive and not just sort of just let it sit there and say, yeah, we'll get to it. I think you can do that, and then as projects drop in, we can look at that traffic study and compare it to the other one, and that becomes a threshold. Where we are is in the process of exploring the evolution of a city over the course of 100 years. That's how I look at it. We're not going to be here, so we have to set the guidelines to how to go about doing that. And if we can do it correctly, we're going to do, I agree, there was a great work in the 2012 study. A lot of what we're talking about is the same stuff that was talked about before. So if we can do that, we have to also be aware that cities don't just evolve from busloads of people showing up and buildings getting filled with people. It's a process over time where buildings come in, they start to get utilized, people start getting comfortable with them, other buildings start coming in because, hey, it's attractive. Success leads to success. But there's this notion that, oh, we're gonna build all these buildings and there's gonna be tons of people that are gonna show up. No, it happens gradual over time, over the course of time. And I think that's one of the things that when I've mentioned that before, it's like, yeah, that's right. You don't suddenly get all of this movement happening. It takes years before a building really sort of integrates with the community.
Just to comment about the architectural review board, definitely, based on my experience, you need an architectural review board because you're going to be reviewing quality of design, and it's important that professionals review that. But originally, I was in favor of an architectural review board with composed of architect, engineer, landscape architect, and that's it. Unfortunately, when we went to City Hall for zoning and comprehensive plan approval, the city commission said, no way, we have to include business person in the board. Originally, I was against it, but my experience is that was very beneficial. Because sometimes the architect and engineer and everybody look from one perspective, and sometimes they are in conflict with the businessman, and I think that you need both in this review board.
Can you put those slides, because I like to give some comments one by one. Quickly, it's a short.
It's your village clerk that has to show.
So, I think one of the issue is that you have a lot of good work, I must say. I'm very happy that especially you're thinking about open spaces and some of those issues, and I think those are very important to the residents. We're talking about creating a destination. Maybe we have to define that, what we mean by destination. Maybe we already did that in some of the meetings. So next slide, please. City center is very important because that connects everybody, north, south, east, and west. So it doesn't mean it's in the center. You know, if it's on 130, 60, that's okay. But I think it should be sustainable city center. We're in the tropics. The whole world wants to reduce the carbon footprints, so we have to make sure that we don't end up using same materials that we've been using last 50 years. Maybe we have to change that to sustainable city center. That will have recycled materials and some of those things. And I think other stuff is good to go to one point. Again, the architecture style, I think it has to be vernacular. Why don't we use some of the materials that we use here in the tropics? So it has to be vernacular architecture rather than a style that is already be using Coral Gables or maybe somewhere else. So we could be a state of the art. And I like the idea of changing materials of US1 because US1 is your gateway, is the front to the whole community, north, south, east, west. So I think the materials have to be recyclable, they have to be used in tropical. We have some of the examples like in the museum, in the Fan Museum, some European architects have used. Why can't we do ourselves? So I think that could be also very important. Design review board, I think it's very important, but we don't want to make it a very stringent review board that who are extremist and that can harm the city. We want to have a design review board where citizens also participate other than the professional people. Next one, please. I think this is one of the best things you have that I've seen in your work that talks about Plaza, Parkway, connections and all those things. That's what the city needs, staggered trees. The chairman already talked about those, so I didn't approve of this. Thank you. Next one. Transition between residential and commercial development, that's very important. Because, commercial, like you go to Publix, how many times? A week. So that's commercial activity. Everybody's running to Publix because people need the food. Same thing, some of the other commercial activities. So we have to have a good transition between the residential, have some sort of connections, transitions, walkways, open spaces, those kind of things. Next one. This is very important. We have to define a character of the Pinecrest Parkway. And the trees are the most important one. We have to change some trees in Pinecrest. We've got to bring some color. Poincianas and other trees that they're very native. So we have some color in the city rather than all green. That looks very good. This is very important. Pedestrian connections and bicycles. We got to encourage people can walk. We have to have a healthy atmosphere. How are you going to be healthy if you don't walk? They all kind of research. If you breathe 15 minutes, think that you're going to live half second extra. For 15 minutes, half second extra. No other doctor will give you that tip. If you do for half an hour, you're living 1 minute. Okay? So we have to encourage the walkways, pedestrian things, so the people could be happy, especially our senior citizenship. Next one.
That's the last slide.
Oh, okay, sounds good.
If I could say something about the market, I live right off of Killian, and when they have the market at Pinecrest Gardens, everybody's walking. I mean, people are walking, it's a tremendous amount of people. So I think if you do provide a logical way and a nice and welcoming way, I think you'll get some movement to these commercial areas. I think just all the commercial area has its back to Pinecrest. And we need to reverse that and make it porous on all directions.
Great. Any questions from the council?
I remember Mr. Kool-Aid had
Oh.
something he wanted to say. Do you want to say anything else?
Did anybody else want to speak? Ronnie?
I wasn't going to say anything because I'm not sure why I'm in this committee, because I'm an architect. I lived in Pinecrest since 1987 when I built my first house. My parents used to live here before Pinecrest was Pinecrest. My dad owned the Flame Restaurant, Sunnyland, which is where I consider the city center of Pinecrest, because if anybody's ever looked at the history and the photography of what US1 looked like and all of that, the Flame Restaurant was a picture that I own that was the only building on US1 when it was 1 lane north, 1 lane south. And the Flame Restaurant was the only building in Sunnyland, and there was nothing around it except cows in the back. So if anybody is interested in history about, city centers and all that kind of stuff, because, my other position is, Pinecrest is not an organically created city. It's man-made. It was made up. It didn't grow. But if you wanted to look at history, it grew from Sunnyland. So while the discussion here is that the city center might be 136 because it's the biggest parcel, blah, 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 and it's across this new station, whatever, that has other values and potentials to me. the city centers of any place doesn't need to be the most dense. It doesn't need to be the most highest in vertical spacing, but it needs to be one that maybe makes sense from historical references. I am an architect. I am a fellow of the American Institute of Architects. I was elevated to fellowship for design. There are several categories you can become a fellow at the AIA, but I was elevated for design, which is probably one of the hardest things to do. My career has been focused on design of buildings and spaces between buildings. And the reason I was elevated to fellowship was because of my simplicity in approaching design. In other words, instead of making something important because you make it complex, you make it important because it is simple and easy to understand and obvious. This is how I approach my design work, whether it's a house, whether it's the South Terminal at the airport in Miami, which I did both, and anything in between, schools, buildings at the universities, office buildings, shopping centers, etc. My problem with a lot of the things that have been talked about here today is that we try to create too many rules, too many limits, and agreeing partially with our chairman, we need to leave design decisions to the design professionals. As an example, there was a slide that showed that said something like, well, ground floor spaces need to have 60% glass. I'm not sure why is it 60, why isn't it 65, why isn't it 80, why isn't it 50? Who made that up? Because it all depends on who is going to occupy the space. If you're going to have a pharmacy on the ground floor of anything, pharmacies don't need 60% of their building walls to be glass, because they need to provide shelving and things of that nature. There are uses that are specific that, and for example, as a personal experience, we're doing a rock climbing gym in the heart of Liberty City in Miami, under one of the Miami-Dade County overlay codes and things of that nature. Well, they have that requirement that 70% of the front on the street has to be glass. Well, a rock climbing gym doesn't have the need, nor does it function in that fashion. So what was the answer? The answer is you go for a variance. So what does that mean? The developer now is pushed back 6, 8, 9, 10 months to get a simple, normal, easy decision, because it was prescribed in the code that you have to have 70% of something. I am all in favor of saying you have to have 70% of glass if you are doing a commercial shopping center or commercial stores on the ground floor, or if you're doing offices. But that should be it. If you have something else, you shouldn't be burdened by that rule. So my whole point about it is that to incentivize the developers to come and do things. And the other thing that, by the way, I have a real hard time about, which I've mentioned earlier on at the beginning of these meetings, and I was not at the last meeting, but I left my list of concerns and things, I don't know if you all got it, is that the private property ownership that makes up the whole edge of US1 is almost not being considered when we talk about these grand ideas of, you know, developing the nodes. And I understand why the focus is on the nodes, because of the stations that are being proposed by the county across the street. But the thinking needs to be all that whole long strip, all of it. Because in between the stations, there's all kinds of properties that are affected. And I don't see in my lifetime, maybe some of you might live long enough to see all this stuff, but I don't see how all these wonderful renderings and all these pictures, which you know, they're great ideas, how they can become real and how they can get people incentivized to develop. You know, the owner of the Sunnyland Shopping Center, what would make him say, you know what, maybe I need to do this because the new code says this and this and this, and I can make more money, I can do this, and I can improve the city. I think that, and I suggested on my thing, that the village of Pinecrest needs a city architect, we need a design review board, and I wasn't just talking about the commercial strip, I'm talking about the whole city, because there are houses, and there are houses, and then there are houses that need some interventions. Okay, and design is not about a style. You know, I prefer a style that I work on that is very modern. It's not for everyone. I would never suggest the city of Pinecrest to look like the things I do. But I can tell you that I could sit in a design review board and judge good design on any style. Okay? And what the city needs is professionals. Maybe they don't even have to be from the city, although I said they should be from the city of Pinecrest in my report. Maybe they should be great architects that are not involved in the city, that are hired or appointed for a certain amount of time to review designs that come up in front of the board. And the least amount of restrictive, you know, you put general statements about height of first floor should be 15, but there should be the ability, if somebody shows up with a design that has a 16-foot floor to floor on the ground floor, that it could be approved without a public hearing and 8, 9, 10 months of variances, etc. And if you allow that to take place, then the less number of restrictions you put on parameters for zoning and for development, the better projects you're going to get. So I'm conflicted because I feel, and I want to reiterate what Jose said earlier, is that the makeup of this committee, of these folks here, from the beginning said we're not allowed to talk to each other unless we're in a public hearing. It's a terrible thing because we should be able to talk about design ideas and come up with ideas as a group rather than he has his ideas, I have my ideas, he has his list, he has his list, he has his list, he has his list. And we don't get to put something together as a group because we're not allowed to meet to discuss that. So I think inherently there's a problem with the organization, and I agree with Jose that maybe we should have a few more meetings that we are allowed to do that. And it doesn't have to be that we have to be hiding in somebody's house. It could be here. And allow anybody that wants to come in and look. But we need to be able to do that because this is very fragmented, very haphazard, too many chopped up ideas that don't make a cohesive plan for the village. And that report that was done in, what was it, 2012 or something? You said it today. We're talking about the same things. Well, what happened? What happened since then? So, if you're going to make a report to me, it needs to be a report that got teeth, it has enforceability, and it has developmentability by people that want to come here and benefit the city.
So I have a question. So I agree what you're saying is, I'm asking you how would we go do it? So you've got to put a zoning code together. It's got to have a set of rules underneath it. My thoughts on a code to work appropriately is you make suggestions in the code and then you allow some level of administrative flexibility as the applicant comes in to do the design. So you don't automatically have a hard and fast standard of 15 feet or XYZ, and then send them to a variance or some other type of public hearing. The planning director, the review boards have that ability to tinker with the design. So
With a design architect, with a city architect.
yeah, right.
Yes, that is what I'm saying.
Okay.
Yeah, we want the first floor to be 15 feet. But you bring in a design that has, for whatever reason, a use that requires 20 feet, you don't need to delay that project. You either approve it or not, or change or what, and you have the ability to make a decision that allows it or modifies it, and maybe it's not 20, maybe it goes to 18, whatever, but something that happens so that development moves along.
So how do you do that?
It's
Yes,
much
sir.
simpler, because all we're trying to do is regulate the height. I agree with you 100%. Residential takes more space than it used to. You gotta have 10 feet or 9 feet or whatever. And so I don't think it's prescriptive about 15. The math was adding 6 by going 15, 10, 10, 10. So that gave you a total number. Inside that total number, cut it up however the hell you want.
No,
But you get four floors and 50 feet. Done.
In my submittal, I put 20 feet, and then 12, 12, 12. Trying to keep it within the discussion that we've been having here of 4 stories. Because you do have to have a definition. What is a story? A story can't be 50 feet. Every city has Coral Gables has 17 feet as 1 story, and it's not limited to the ground. You can have a 17-story second story. Okay, so I'm not saying that you should not have any restrictions, but that the flexibility by some portion of a design review board, the zoning director, a group of people that are professional design experts that review the projects, commercial and residential. I'm not limiting it to commercial. To make better projects and to incentivize people to say, I can go to Pinecrest and I can develop this idea that I have where maybe at the city of Miami, I'd be in a wheelchair before I get approved. And I'm going through that now on other projects in the city of Miami, the city of Miami Beach, Miami-Dade County, the city of Coral Gables.
One more question, but I agree, and that's one of the reasons why I wanted to go through a review of the zoning code, because it just hasn't been updated, effectively in so long. It doesn't. Every applicant in every city complains that that city is too slow and it's impossible to develop. And so, with a fresh look at this and how you, not necessarily what we're mandating in the zoning code, but how you administratively deal with it to get an applicant through the process with that flexibility. In the end, you've got to be able to say, right, whatever, 20% flexible, this side of that. So you got to put parameters on it. The last question I had was, how do you said about the drugstore that's going into the first floor space? I mean, a lot of these buildings aren't they're not going to be single-use buildings. The drugstore may not be the use that's there in 25 years. How do you give the flexibility to design the space and allow it to evolve to its next generation of use and still maintain that first aspect that you were designing for it in the first place? So, for instance, you had mentioned transparency on the first floor. A drugstore doesn't need it, but if you didn't do it and the use changes over, you've lost that transparency. Are there architectural ways to maintain the ability to convert to the transparency?
I think that's part of the review process of a design. If you have a building that has got no glass in the front, for example, it was a drugstore, and then somebody walks in and they want to do a clothing store, they're going to want to put glass on it.
Right.
You don't need, but as it comes in front of the city, you then at that time say, well, the use changed, so now you have to do this. You want to be here, you have to put glass.
Okay. No, I understand. I think that having, yes, sir.
And to add to that, and that sort of gradual transition to other usage. There's an owner of a building that has a certain set of rules that wants there to be a homogeneous look of the building, so that the next occupant that's not the owner of that building can't just go in there and blow out the whole place and change it. But I think that there are several ideas, several big ideas that were brought up, which I think that and we didn't talk about earlier that Ronnie brought up, which is this notion of a village architect. And if we're going to be comprehensive and completely comprehensive of a plan that's going to last for a very long time, we truly have to look at what's happening with what's behind this street. And of course, that wasn't our mission right now. Okay, so we're kind of tempting to consider an idea of having a professional architect to sort of look at some of these buildings that are being built that I tend to look away when I don't like what I see. And that has not always been the case in Pinecrest. Well, there's some of these projects that are coming in that I'm surprised what they look like. And so my personal way of dealing with it is I don't look. So I do agree that a village architect would be a really good idea. And remember that I look at this as a policy meeting. We're talking about these global ideas, planning in these large ways, not trying to get stuck in between the weeds on a certain 15 feet or 42 feet. It's policy and trying to create policy. Or you're trying to create policy. We're sitting here and trying to give you some good ideas, right? So this idea, I think, moving forward is a very good idea, because especially the value of that land to have to be stuck with a project or a building that really doesn't add anything. I think it's kind of not fair for the rest of us that we have to look at, right? So I tend to agree with that, and the implementation, I think, is very important. Because at the end of the day, the architect, the village architect is going to meet with us. We're going to tinker with the building. We're going to make it feel very comfortable. But that clerk and that processing people at the building department, when you don't have a set of rules, all of a sudden there are hard rules that sometimes they get, it's interpretation. That's how we used to do it. It's not clear, so this is how we're going to do it. And then, so you hit the wall through the building permitting process, because now you have a number of clerks that are they're like soldiers. Bah, 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 bah. And you get knocked down at counted at a number of times. It's like 9 plus one more, which is the whole landscape part, which takes longer than structure, right? So, as we sort of look at this and streamline this, we have to look at it from that standpoint too. That permitting process has to be something that is a reasonable process, and that they're not, it's not, by interpretation, we believe it's like this. So then the designer is stuck with, listen, I just gotta move the project. At this point, I'll do whatever you want. I'm gonna put the hedge, and we're gonna call it a day. Because you just can't battle each one of these small issues. The developer, we have to look after the concerns of the welfare of the developer as much as the people. They're putting the money in, they're spending that thing, they're at risk, so you have to help. We haven't had, by the way, and what Pepe is saying, and I tend to agree, unfortunately, the rule was set up that we can't talk to each other. All right, and I was hoping that we could talk to each other in a way that, we could just get it done and come up with a bunch of ideas. It didn't work out that way. So working within the system, we've been kind of moving it along, and Stephanie said, look, the sunshine law. Boom. And the sunshine law, I don't want to go to jail. I want to help you, but I don't want to go to jail. So if this is the way you're going to do it, I'm not going to jail. The rest of you can go to jail, but I'm not doing it.
All right. That's what the state legislators have done for themselves. They can speak to each other up to 3 people, but they ban everybody else in the state from talking up to 3 people.
And we, of course, are subject to the same.
So I'm just saying that.
On text, we got to wrap it up in 10 minutes. We got the police.
So anyway,
how do we get the shoes? He's done.
That really pretty much is the last stuff. I agree with the architectural review.
Got it. I think.
Okay, so we're going to wrap up because we have been here for a long time. So I have one comment. Since World War I, most of the architectural profession has been designing buildings one by one. And and then think about the cities. And that's the result we got in North America, globally, everywhere, the traffic mess and all that. So we have to start thinking, I think Melissa said in the first slide, characteristic. See, what is the character do you want? Do you want to keep the agriculture setting, or do you want to do something else? And then the profit, the ownership comes into the picture. So if the pharmacy wants to use all the parking space, be good. But can give a little space so the city also becomes a better place to live. So I think on that note, I will end and let you, Mr. Mayor, finish the
Thank you,
meeting.
Councilwoman Del Prado.
Did you have one last comment, sir?
Yeah,
I don't wanna interrupt.
are we going to continue with a meeting or 1 or 2 meetings?
It's whatever you want to do
Well,
after
the
this. I
question is
think.
time, actually the question is time, because I think that you have a deadline of the end of the month, and we have time to go in with the idea situation, we can meet before we meet with the council again.
I'm gonna leave those administrative details to staff and let them decide whatever you want to do. I'm fine with it. I want you guys to be comfortable with whatever you suggested. If you need more time to have conversations amongst yourselves, that's fine. I just, we'll work through our administrative issues and then Melissa's cringing. Did I say so? We'll work through it. You guys will work through it. But that's, I don't want to get hung up there. We're still problem.
Okay. Having listened to the workshops and the discussion today, my takeaway is that, of course, several improvements have been made for the Pinecrest Parkway, and I want to thank you so much for that. I know that you put so much time into this. But to allay controversy and concerns that have arisen in our community over the course of the past several months, I want to confirm 2 points that I understand go to the heart of the matter. Number one, the proposal in terms of building height, and I know nothing is firm, but at this point, the proposal in terms of building height is to go from 45 feet to 51. Am I correct in that?
Yes, as a base.
Okay. And the maximum proposed FAR is 1.0. And if I understand from Mr. Coolidge's comments during the workshop, this is modest and may not even be perceptible to the naked eye. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, thank you. That's all I wanted to confirm and understand. Thank you.
Okay, so any questions from council?
And again, and to continue to piggyback on Councilmember Del Prado's comments, my understanding of the general consensus was that a great deal of good architecture and interesting redevelopment could happen within a four-story envelope. It's not necessary on each and every parcel or any parcels necessarily with good design and good architecture and the ability to be creative, to go above
That's why I put
four stories. There's no requirement that we go above four stories. Is that correct?
Correct, with the
With the
addition
caveat,
that
so-
we modify the underlying requirements of parking and open space so that they
Correct.
can allow that to happen in the right way.
And that fundamentally, the more creativity we allow our design professionals, our architects, the more interesting the result is going to be. And that the less prescriptive we are, the better architecture we're going to get, and the better sort of livable spaces we're going to get in our shared community work. Is that a good way to put it in layman's terms?
As long as you have those gate valves or those safety checks,
Safety valves, yeah. Mhm.
that there's always going to be a rub.
Mhm.
And good design oftentimes brings that with them because it's unexpected.
So we have to basically.
So you have to
install
allow for the rub to happen
Mhm.
so that you can get to the best that you can get.
Mhm.
But when you have those draconian limitations, you don't let a good designer do it.
Okay. And then we install basically kill switches in our code. So whatever's happening with the design, the way you create some sense of security and for the community is by designing kill switches. No matter what you're doing, this is ultimately your max in height, FAR, whatever. At this point, you're stopped dead in your tracks. There's no further way to go. Got it. Thank you. That's very, very helpful.
Ms. Manager?
Mr. Mayor, my question to the committee was, if there seems to be consensus on what we've talked about currently, the question is, have you had a chance to look at our current code and provided for example, suggestions on the actual changes that would need to happen in the code to staff so that we can start looking at, what does that mean? You talked about, is it, okay, you take away the fact that you have to have X amount of parking spaces for this, then what does that really, what should it look like? So that we could start thinking, how do you effectuate some of these concepts, and where there might be some, concerns for council or things that we have to vet. The only thing that I'll mention, just in talking about and in thinking and listening to the consideration of having like an architectural review board and that sort of thing, like a city architect, is I've always felt one of the things that made Pinecrest unique was that we weren't overly regulating private development. And so like Coral Gables has that framework where a lot of things have to go through an architectural review board. And this is just thinking off the top of my head, and I don't know how the committee feels about it, but I would caution that we don't get into something where we become Coral Gables in the sense that then nothing can be done unless, because I think that a lot of people like their freedom, like to be able to build whatever home they, and I understand that everything is like beauty is in the eye of the beholder, but I don't know how to temper the idea of maybe being overly restrictive, and that would be my concern.
But we already have in our code that it has to conform to the community. So it's really a catch-all, because what that spurs is that if Steve and Leo, the building director, planning director, and the manager see a plan, it has in the past, they've been told this doesn't fit with the community. They have a right to appeal that before council, So in essence, we have that in our code. Is it as strict as you actually have architects or professionals that are reviewing, or a committee like yourselves reviewing? No, but so it is in our code already. We made sure that that's in there. So somebody can't build a Dr. Seuss house down the street from you, Ronnie. That's not allowed. Steve would catch that. The manager would say no. Now they can always appeal to council too.
And if I can add, the building official is an architect also, Paul Buckler. The building official is an architect. But what I would recommend with regard to development in these 5 alternative business districts would be to allow, to treat any development as a conditionally permitted use that has to come to the village council. The village council can impose requirements that those plans be reviewed by an architectural review board specifically for development within those 5 zones as a first step. Having an architect review everything could be having one individual city architect approve and sign off on designs. I think you could run into a potential problem where, he'll approve my design, he'll approve his designs, but he won't approve my designs. I don't know if it's impartial as a review board would be. That having been said, if you want to establish an architectural review board to review every project that comes in for permitting, that is going to be extensive and take a long time to move the project through.
What I think we should do now, I think we should focus on the zoning code, right? And then our processes and procedures we can work through at a different time. Every zoning code is going to have processes and procedures to it, but there's a little bit more time and flexibility with that. If there's nothing else, I'm going to conclude the meeting. If you have a question, I'll answer it after the meeting, and then we'll go. Thank you all very much. You guys did great work. You're doing great work. And one more, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to get the comment to the councilwoman that she was trying to describe. We don't want to be overly regulating. We don't want to become like Coral Gables. So I think that's very important. So you don't kill the goose by doing good things. Just keep the eye on the characteristic of the city and see where we're going. Because otherwise, the traffic and congestion all becomes part of it. Over-regulating is not a good idea.
Let me just add one thing, okay, because I want to get to a point. And I think that the focus of the conversation and why we were involved was primarily for the corridor.
Yes.
And the notion of a review board was for those sites that were of a certain size and a certain threshold. And that's the end of that conversation. In regards to the other, and I'm not, and I'm gonna say this, I don't like to be regulated by anybody, any architectural review board, and neither does Ron. Okay, so for us to present that to you and say, look, I think there has to be some limitations, it's kind of like, I'm cutting my own veins, but if you guys don't want to do it, then I understand, we'll be successful anyway because our stuff is really good. But there's some stuff that comes out that generally is a little below the threshold, and I think that when you've lived enough life, you say, well, maybe it's not a bad idea to have someone be the gatekeeper, keep an eye out for stuff that's getting in and shouldn't be there. So I don't want to harp on we don't want to be like Coral Gables because there's a lot of smart people in Coral Gables.
John.
And I also want to say one last thing. The city of Miami Beach developed a similar review board process that is even more draconian than Coral Gables, but look at the wonderful work that they've done. So, there's something to be said about a teacher minding the class. Sometimes you have to have someone there that's shepherding the group. And that, I think that's the point about the residential stuff that's going on in our city. That we, maybe it's a good idea, maybe it's not, but that wasn't for us to look at for this.
But John, I think that what you're saying is, and Ronnie, is that the overlay is not a right of use, it's a conditional use. That will have to go before this board and the community in drawings where there will be we can put any conditions. Now that may be a time where we do as a council agrees, because times are going to change in 10 years and another 10 years, you guys have seen it. We've all seen it. I've been here 36 years. They're changing drastically every year. So that idea that it's an overlay, that it's not just a right, that they'll have to become for the application and the drawings and the color of the paint and the facade of the walls in coral, the columns, the verandas, all of that will have to come, the rooftop landscaping, we can all condition that. So I think and the public will get to have their input at that point, everybody. So I think it's in place, kinda, so I'm not too scared of it. I see your concerns, because you're right, they want to try and grab everything they can, but
with moderation, right?
Yeah.
All right, guys, I gotta wrap up, we got 3 hours of police
I
talk.
just want to respond to the manager. You don't need to have a design review board to be overly regulated. The city of Miami has Miami 21. They don't have a design review board. And the regulations of the zoning code alone make it impossible to do many projects. And for Steve, to respond to you, yeah, there may be the time that somebody says, well, that project got approved. Why didn't my project get approved? Well, maybe your project wasn't good enough. Okay? And that is the difference in looking at projects and reviewing them from people that are trained in this arena to make suggestions and to make better a project that gets submitted. So maybe the guy that said, well, my project didn't get approved, well, maybe you can do this and this and this, it might get approved.
Thank you all very much, great work.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Go all the way till noon and then start 3 hours. Right? Somebody's got to take a break.
Can I have white drops?
Maybe we ought to get